Each week I try to, typically on Sunday or Monday, do a bit of a kitchen reset where I meal prep and meal plan for the coming week. I do this pretty loosely. I'm not usually preparing entire pre-made lunches. More often I'm prepping some snacks, pantry staples, or a meal for us to eat off for a few days, and just making a general plan of what we're going to have this week. I try to make sure I pull out some meat as well because protein is always the holdup when it comes to dinner if I don't have something thawed. I also try to use this day to do things like make broth or start a new batch of water kefir or kombucha. I always start this by taking stock of what we do have in the fridge that needs to be used up to try to avoid any food waste. This week I know we have lots of chopped cabbage in the fridge, so that will likely become salads and slaw for salmon tacos, along with the cassava flour tortillas and peach salsa that I have in the fridge to use up. Then what I'm prepping is just to fill in any gaps. This week is no different than any other in that what I'm prepping is a little bit random. I know many of you are likely following along with the Pantry Challenge hosted by Three Rivers Homestead, and I'm really using this time to focus on shopping our canning pantry and freezers to make sure we are utilizing everything we put up and raise here on our small homestead. This week I have kombucha that needs to be bottled for a second fermentation and a new batch to start up. I do have a detailed video of this entire process coming soon for those of you that have expressed interest in this. The first thing I got going was a new batch of tea for my next round of homemade kombucha. I brought 14 cups of water to a boil, then turned off the heat and added 8 black tea bags and a cup of cane sugar. I wanted to get this done first because it needs to come down to room temperature before I can continue on with the process. Homemade broth is something that we use pretty much daily, and I tend to rely on my home canned bone broth, but I do have a ton of chicken carcasses and feet in the freezer that need used up, so when I do have the extra time, I'm trying to get to those instead of just pulling from the pantry. So usually when I make broth in the Instant Pot, I'll cook it on high pressure for about 4 hours. Today, just to speed up the process, I did 2 hours so that I could get to everything else that I wanted to get done today. So for my canned broth, I typically will leave it really plain just to keep it versatile, but when I'm making broth specifically to use in soup, I like to add in garlic, onion, carrots, usually some celery too, or just some veggie scraps that I like to keep in the freezer. While the broth was going, I got started on some homemade gummies. I make these intermittently. We like to do a lot of snack type lunches, so these are just a great addition to that. So I just do a quart of juice. You can use whatever you like. Today I'm using our home canned grape juice, and this is really concentrated, so no need to add any sweetener. Then I do 5 tablespoons of grass-fed gelatin. The easiest way to do this is to pour the juice into a pot, and while it's cold, sprinkle the gelatin over top. I like to measure it out separately because I find sprinkling it over the top in one go helps to avoid any clumps. Allow the gelatin to bloom in the juice for about 5 minutes, and then turn the heat up and bring that to a low boil and allow the gelatin to fully dissolve. You could get fancy with this and use fun molds, but I just poured it into a glass dish. I let that cool on the counter a bit, then transferred it to the fridge, and you want that to fully set at least 6 hours before cutting that into squares. Gelatin is rich in glutamic acid, which converts to glutamine in the body, and it is especially supportive of gut health. So this is just a fun way to get in gelatin on top of the bone broth that we consume most days. Now, I don't always prep a sweet treat, but on occasion I like to, and this week I wanted to make an apple loaf because I have both applesauce and apples to get through. If you've been around my channel before, chances are you've heard me talk about how oat flour is one of my very favorite gluten-free baking flours, so that is the base of this apple loaf as well. Making oat flour at home is beyond simple. Just blend up rolled oats in a high-speed blender until it forms a fine flour. For the apple loaf, I needed a 1/4 cup of melted butter, so I got that going on the stovetop. This is a 1-bowl recipe, as are pretty much all of my baking recipes, because I don't want any unnecessary dishes if I can help it. So to a large bowl, I added a 1/2 cup of unsweetened applesauce, a 1/2 cup of milk, a good splash of vanilla, and an egg. To that, I added the melted butter and 2/3 of a cup of cane sugar. I find a granulated sugar works best in this. Typically, my preference is panela, which is an unrefined cane sugar, also called sucanat, but I am all out of that. You could also use maple sugar or coconut sugar here. Got that all mixed together, and then I added in the 2 cups of oat flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, and a 1/2 teaspoon each of baking soda, salt, and cinnamon. Mix that all up, and then I added 2 diced apples. You could do whatever kind you like here. I greased my cast iron loaf pan really well with some butter, then transfer that batter to the loaf pan. Now, my original plan and what I typically like to do is to swirl some apple butter into the top, which makes it really pretty, but I didn't have a jar open, so I ended up just mixing up a bit of cinnamon sugar to put on top. This is delicious, but I find that when I do this, the loaf tends to fall a bit flat. You'll see that later once I pull it out of the oven, but it is delicious either way. This bakes at 350 for 50 minutes. While the apple loaf was baking, I got started on a batch of lentil soup. I love lentil soup, it's one of my favorites, and we have a bunch of lentils to use up right now, so this is going to be on repeat throughout the winter. as always, these recipes will be in the description box down below. I diced up a yellow onion, and to my Dutch oven over medium-low, I added a couple tablespoons of bacon fat. You can just do olive oil or butter here, but this adds a ton of good flavor. So I added in the onions, and then I minced up a few large garlic cloves, added those in as well, and I let that all saute for a few minutes. I got a couple carrots chopped, and I added those in along with a package of the celery that I froze from the garden this year. This is probably about 2 to 3 stalks. So I let that cook for about 15 minutes or so to brown up a bit and develop some good flavor. At this point, the apple loaf was done, so I pulled that out of the oven and got the broth strained. This batch of broth made enough broth for the soup, plus enough for us to use if we cook rice throughout the week, or for more soup, or just to sip on. So we are going to be very well stocked. Once the veg had browned a bit, I added in 2 cups of rinsed lentils. Green are my preference, but you can use whatever you like. 6 cups of chicken broth, about 1.5 to 2 cups of some home canned plain tomato sauce. This is a thin tomato sauce that I made specifically to use in soups, so I did about 1/2 quart of that. You could also do crushed tomatoes here or diced tomatoes. I also added in some paprika, cumin, and coriander. I don't really measure, probably about 2 teaspoons of paprika, a 1/2 teaspoon each of cumin and coriander. At this point, I'd also usually add a bay leaf, but I ran out, so left that out today, and it still turned out great. I added in some salt, probably about a teaspoon or so. If you're using store-bought broth, you're going to want to cut back on that quite a bit. Then I brought that up to a boil and reduced it down to a simmer. Once it boils, you're going to see a little bit of scum form on the top from the lentils. I like to just spoon that off, and then I cover the Dutch oven and allow that to simmer for about 45 minutes. While the soup was simmering, I continued with my next batch of kombucha. I leave the tea bags in the tea mixture until it has cooled, so I removed those and poured it into a gallon-sized jar. You do want to make sure that it is room temperature. If it's too warm, you're going to run the risk of killing your SCOBY. If you're not familiar, a SCOBY is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeasts, and it feeds off the sugar and the caffeine to turn the sweetened black tea mixture into kombucha. So I transferred the SCOBY from my last batch into my new batch. Now, if it sinks, that's nothing to worry about. That just happens if there is any sort of temperature difference between the two. So I also added in 2 cups of the brewed kombucha from my last batch. This acts as a starter, and I covered that, and it is ready to go. So that's just going to sit for about 2 to 4 weeks. It tends to go a lot faster in the summer, slower in the winter just due to temperatures. For my second fermentation, I'm doing a blackberry lemon flavor. To my flip-top bottles, I added some blackberry syrup I made with our blackberries. It's just blackberries simmered down with some water and sugar, and I also added in a splash of lemon juice. Now, typically you do a ratio of 1 to 4 juice or fruit to kombucha for your second ferment, but this is a pretty concentrated syrup, so I went with a little bit less. I topped off the bottles with the kombucha and closed them up. These will sit for about 2 to 10 days, burping the bottles daily to release any excess pressure, and this is when the kombucha is going to carbonate. So I'll just taste this after a couple days and allow it to continue to ferment to our liking. The lentil soup had been simmering for about 45 minutes, and I added in some fresh lemon juice just from a whole lemon, and this turned out so good. This is a favorite lentil recipe of mine, and I like to add a little bit of balsamic vinegar when I go to serve. This turned into dinner for us this day and lunch for several days after. The apple loaf turned out so good. Definitely allow it to fully cool before slicing so it holds together. Thank you for spending the day in the kitchen with me. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.